Hi, everybody. Meteorologist Joe Chaffee. Welcome to the Joe Chaffee Weather Show on this Thursday, the 29th day of August, 2019. And, of course, we know what we're going to be talking about tonight, and that is Hurricane Dorian. We're going to cover a lot of different areas here with respect to where this is all going, and I want to be clear about a couple of things. Certainly, conditions are favorable for strengthening. The Hurricane Center has said so. They also are forecasting this to become a Category 4 hurricane before making landfall. But I want to emphasize that even though that's what the forecast is, you have to wait for it to verify, and you want to at least start to see some indications that Dorian is on its way to strengthening, because there have been many a storm that has been forecast to strengthen, and then for one reason or another, it doesn't happen. If you think back to last year, Mr. Rayo is also going to be joining us tonight, but he's one to have to make an entrance, so he did.
I want to be quiet as possible here, Joe.
Oh, that's fine.
No, that's
I'm making the point that because you heard me screaming at the television screen when one of the other networks already basically wiping out the southeast in terms of describing the storm in the hyperbole, and we don't do that here. I'm just trying to at least to express that this is a process that we're watching. We're going to be, of course, trying to forecast the fact that this may become a major hurricane, but we'll kind of take the steps that you have to take as they happen.
Haven't you learned by now, after 40 years in this business, that
I know if it bleeds,
it leads, and that's exactly what is happening here. And it's a holiday weekend, so they have to drum up.
Right.
I'm not trying to downplay this. This is a very dangerous situation, and you want to prepare the hundreds of thousands or millions of people down in Florida for what may be coming their way. But it's just, instead of saying it in a calming type of voice and telling them we're here to hold your hand, so to speak, it's like terrible, that kind of thing, and it gets me upset as I'm sure it gets you upset.
Yeah. Now, that being said, we're going to go through a few scenarios here that some of the models have indicated. There are a few key points that I think are really important in terms of where this ultimate track is. There's a big difference. There is a difference if there's a landfall in Miami versus Fort Lauderdale versus up the coast to Cape Canaveral, Jupiter, and so on.
But may I say this? Yesterday, if you were somebody who was living in New Orleans, Louisiana, you were probably hearing the local meteorologist say, now take a look at this track. It's cutting right across Florida.
Wow.
This is very similar to what Andrew did. Now it goes back out over the Gulf of Mexico, and it looks like it's heading very close to where we are. That was what they were saying yesterday. And now the new storm tracks are taking the storm into Florida, slowing it down dramatically, and then edging it northward up toward Georgia and South Carolina. And the people
which we don't necessarily know whether that's the case at this point.
But the people in New Orleans are probably saying, "Oh, we could breathe a sigh of relief." You can't breathe a sigh of relief because nobody really knows.
This is like the winter time with snowstorms. It's there, it's not there. It's a foot. They're looking at stuff 10 days out, 8 days out. But what I do want to emphasize is that we're going to look at the upper air. We're going to look at the upper air and what's happening. And there are some things on the upper air that are disturbing to me. And if they play out, it could perhaps create a rather ominous situation for Florida in particular. Right. So let's go through this. We're going to go through it calmly. The first things first is I want to look at is Joe, I'm going to bring up the satellite loop. Oh, and by the way, as I'm setting this up, do you know who's watching tonight?
Who is watching?
Janet Allshouse.
Janet.
Yes. Hi, Janet.
Janet was a good supervisor when I was starting out in television at News 12 Long Island.
No, she was both our bosses.
And we knew her as Janet Powerhouse. Janet, you ruled with an iron hand. But I tell you, we need more supervisors like this. She could be tough when she needed to, but she could also be a very good friend. And I remember her as one of the best people.
You said it perfectly.
Yeah.
So I'm sure Janet's saying like, okay, boys, this is not this is
mutual
not the virtual exactly. Move on. Okay, which we shall. Now let's look at the satellite loop tonight. I'm noticing, Joe, on the last few frames, and while noticing on the last few frames what could be the beginnings of the appearance of an eye. It's very small.
Yeah.
It's a little hard to see, but if you look close, you can see on the last frame it kind of pops there.
Little thing, yeah. And of course, now that the storm is continuing on that west-northwest trajectory over a region where there's going to be not much in the way of wind shear to tear at it, and also the waters are nice and warm, bathtub-like in the low and mid 80s. So this thing certainly has the potential to really start intensifying, such is the reason why the forecasts are suggesting that perhaps by midday on Monday, before it makes landfall, somewhere along the Florida coastline, we could be talking about a Category 4 storm with 130-plus mile-per-hour winds.
The other thing that's missing now is the dry air environment, and we've been going through that the last few days, showing the relative humidity at the mid levels of the atmosphere, how it was in an environment, in a moist environment, was completely surrounded by dry air,
right?
Bone dry air down when it was
east, tongue twister,
right? When it was east of the Windward Islands. All that dry air is gone now, and it has emerged now in a moist environment, and that moist environment extends all the way back through Florida. And you could see just from the loops, if you think back to the satellite loops from a couple of days ago, where it was clear for many hundreds of miles in all directions around it. But now when you look to the west, you've got outflow from some downpours and thunderstorms that are developing through the Bahamas, down through Cuba, and into the Northwest Caribbean.
Look at Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico got some pretty heavy. It looks like they had some pretty heavy squalls and wind. The storm itself, the actual center of the storm, as you can see,
is way
to the north, but still on the backlash, so to speak. They're
getting more weather today probably in Puerto Rico than yesterday. Now, the Virgin Islands got nailed yesterday, and that was because Dorian went into a bit of a strengthening burst right as it was moving over the Virgin Islands, and that when we had the hurricane hurricane reconnaissance aircraft pilots at MacArthur Airport a couple of years ago, one of the conversations that we had was the fact that they even said it's far worse. Sometimes it can actually be far worse in terms of the conditions that they meet when they're flying into a strengthening tropical storm, becoming a hurricane, than as opposed to flying into a mature Category 3 or Category 4 storm.
Right.
That when you go in there during the development stage, it can get really, really rocky. And a lot of that translated to some wind gusts in excess of 90 and 100 miles an hour that occurred in and around the Virgin Islands yesterday.
Right. And you have ambivalence, or I have ambivalence when I say this, because the island of Haiti, of course, occupied by a good number of people, but also the island of Haiti and Hispaniola has very high mountains, and had the storm moved over the mountainous terrain, it would have certainly knocked the wind out of that storm to a significant degree, and maybe even ripped the storm to not completely to pieces, but would have weakened it considerably. But it completely and totally missed Haiti, and is now wide open as it's beginning to move over that warm Gulf of Mexico water, set to go in terms of the anticipated increase in wind strength and just overall the size of the storm as well.
Now, I brought up this particular model for a reason, the HMON, HMON. And it's a model that's very tight on the storm. I'm not 100% sure how this particular model how it works in terms of what data it uses, but I'm bringing this up because I want to make this point, and that is, You get a lot of folks, you look at these models, the maps print out all these sorts of pressures all over the place. And right now, as of the 5 o'clock advisory from the Hurricane Center, the lowest pressure, we can't get it off this map, but I believe it was either 986 or 985 millibars. Well, the HMON model for 5 o'clock this evening has 974. So for the same time, it's 12 millibars too low.
Right.
So you have to really be careful when you look at these things. Now, for example, by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the pressure is going to drop from 980 down to 951. That's a 986 to 951 is 35 millibars, and it's going to do it in 12 hours time from now. Well, if it's
totally impossible, we have seen storms in the Katrina, for example, was a classic example of a rapid deepening, but that doesn't happen all that often.
No, well, but my overall point is that this is why you have to really be careful when you look at these and you see some of these prints. I can remember somebody asking me, there was one of the storms, maybe it was Florence, where there was obviously a problem with one of the models because it printed like an 875 pressure east of Elizabeth City, North Carolina,
right,
which basically defies the laws of physics.
Exactly.
So thermodynamics. So you look, a lot of this stuff when you see it, if it seems ridiculous, more than likely it probably is. So again, I just wanted to bring that up with respect to making that point. Now here's the Hurricane Center's forecast. They really haven't changed much of this since this morning. They do have this as a major hurricane by 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And if an eye is appearing on the satellite loop now, perhaps we're seeing that strengthening trend beginning, but we'll know that there's a reconnaissance aircraft that's on the way now, and perhaps later on in this show it'll be close enough where we could see a little bit of data coming in. But the forecast becoming a major hurricane, and that turn to the west, northwest, and taking it through the northern Bahamas, the northwestern Bahamas, and having it on the Florida coast by 2 p.m. Monday. But one of the things that they pointed out, and this may actually be a plus because they would give people a little more time, the models themselves have been slowing. We went from having landfalls yesterday, looked like it was going to be on Sunday. Now it looks like it may be, more like later on Monday. And if the European and the new GFS is also slower and further south, but my point is that we may be looking at landfalls Monday night into Tuesday, which buys folks in Florida a bit more time.
Right.
And it's only Thursday, so if you've already started your preparations, it seems like looking at what we saw on the videos tonight that a lot of people may have already done their preparations. Right. They got underway early. But this is the Hurricane Center's official forecast, and I'm just going to remind everybody that when it comes to specific information with respect to your area, please consult your local officials, your local National Weather Service office, or the National Hurricane Center with regards to the decisions that you have to make and how to make the right decisions for you.
I've said this before, and I think you'll agree with me, that we, the two of us, although we've been in the business now for 40 some odd years, we are pretty much, in terms of meteorology and forecasting, general practitioners.
Right.
We are not experts in hurricane forecasting. We're not experts in severe weather. We've certainly garnered enough knowledge over the years to make some
general statements.
But
and you and I can talk about our own neighborhoods, where we live or where we grew up.
Right.
But unless we've lived where you live, it's hard for us to know what the impacts of your local topography are, the local rivers, streams, shoreline, back bays, and everything else.
The guys at the Hurricane Center have specialized in this. I would think that, the National Weather Service has the Climate Prediction Center. They make long-range weather forecasts. I'm sure that somebody from the Hurricane Center would defer to somebody at the Climate Prediction Center if it meant to how the upcoming winter is going to be. And the same thing holds true for people at the Climate Prediction Center. I'm sure they would probably say, well, if you want to know about where this hurricane is going, the specifics and everything else, you go to the guys at the climate at the They used to call it the Tropical Prediction Center.
Right,
And now
TPC.
it's the National Hurricane Center.
All right, so now we have, I have the Hurricane Dorian model track guidance, courtesy of tropicaltidbits.com. You'll notice up in the upper right, it says, do not use this map to make decisions, seek official information. So that just reinforces what we just said. The important thing here is to look where the vast majority of models are clustered. And we've also noticed that those models, they've been kind of going back and forth, and sometimes a little north, sometimes a little south. This latest move has been a bit more to the south. There are a couple of outliers, and I can kind of understand how they get to those points with what some of those models did. But the vast majority, except for the two or three outliers there, the vast majority take it inland somewhere along the central coast of Florida, probably either Monday or a Monday night into Tuesday. So that leads confidence at least to say that certainly the risks for Florida continue to rise through all of this. I like looking at them because sometimes when you've got a situation where there's a lot of stuff going on and you see all these tracks going in all different directions, they give you the variability, but they also give you the confidence when they're all bunched up together.
Right. There's always going to be an outlier. There's always going to be one or two models that go their own way or whatever like that, but it is very good that the vast majority of this particular, for this particular storm, this particular run, they're all, as you just said, clustered pretty much on a track that would take the storm somewhere into the central coast of eastern Florida by sometime on Monday.
Right. Now here's the intensity guidance, which is what we're waiting for to see what Dorian's going to do tonight and Friday in terms of strengthening. And a vast majority of the models take it to a Cat 3, and some do take it up to a Category 4. So that also lends confidence to the fact that this is going to become a major hurricane. There are a few that just kind of keep it as a strong Cat 1 or a Cat 2, but the vast majority seem to go the route of a major.
I think if you ask any of the hurricane forecasters what's the most difficult aspect of the storm to forecast, it is the intensity. The track is a lot easier actually than trying to forecast the intensity because there's so many variables.
Well, look what happened with Michael last year,
right,
which
right.
suddenly exploded into a Category 5, and I don't think anybody really anticipated that happening, but it did.
And the same thing with Katrina. If you remember that Sunday morning back in 2005, I think, we all woke up and all of a sudden a storm which when we went to bed it was like a Category 2, all of a sudden jumped all the way up to a Cat 5 and was making full bore toward New Orleans. So these things happen, and
right.
you have to, as the old saying goes, prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
This is the NOAA 2 recon that is out there right now. This last ob from just 7 minutes ago. Now it's flying into the storm, into Dorian, and it has just reached the westernmost periphery of it. So they're not quite there yet into the center, but they're on their way. So we're going to check back a little later on to see where they are and if they've reached the center, and maybe we can get an idea of what's happening there. So let's go forward. I'm going to jump to. This is our satellite, so we already did that. But there's one other thing I wanted to point out on the satellite, folks, and I'm gonna come back to this when we look at the overall upper air pattern. Keep an eye on the clouds that you see back from Florida down through Cuba and into the Northwest Caribbean. There is some kind of mid-level low here that I think is going to develop into a surface low and possibly even a tropical depression or a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico early next week, moving westward. And the reason why I bring it up is I think this system is going to be a big player with regards to what happens to Dorian. So now that I've said that, I'm going to jump to the new GFS. And Dorian is on the lower right. And here's why I think it's important. And this might be the reason why this particular run of the GFS has gone gone south, because I cheated, I looked at it at the time, has gone south and is not that far away from what the European did, which pretty much took a storm in just south of Miami. You'll notice that as we go through the first frames, I'm going to just make this a little smaller so you can see both the time and the map itself. Let me make sure this is centered for everybody. Okay, so you can see the top. On the top is the time, and it's in Greenwich Mean Time. So this is at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Let me back it up. You can watch it It looks like through 2 o'clock in the afternoon it's moving northwest, and now it seems like I think it's making that turn more toward the west-northwest, or even just north of due west.
Right.
For the first time, the GFS is recognizing that see that low, Joe, that's out in the central Gulf?
Right.
That low, this GFS was the only model that really wasn't picking up on this. Now it has, and I think what's happening is that you're seeing lower pressures here in the central Gulf states, which basically has created a weakness that Dorian is responding to, on top of the fact that you've got this upper ridge to the north.
Right.
So it's moving west here, and it goes inland, not too far north of Miami now on this run.
Right.
So the GFS on this run seems to have come into line with what the European, the Icon, and the Canadian run have been doing, which is to favor attracting to Florida further to the south rather than further to the north.
If I recall correctly, Andrew in 1992 took a track just slightly to the south of Miami. I think it was down toward Homestead,
right,
Florida.
And it was the course came in almost from the west-south, from the east-northeast.
Right.
So it was moving, I believe, west-southwest as it came in.
And that strongly influenced the folks at the Hurricane Center too. They were not in Miami, but they were at Coral Gables, if I remember correctly. That they said that the walls were shaking. Did they lose one of their radar?
Yeah, I believe they did.
So this, for them, these people who forecast, who provide the very valuable information to all of us on these storms, these guys and gals who are going to be at the Hurricane Center on Monday, a holiday of all days too, are probably going to be putting themselves in danger, being in a place in the direct path of a major storm like this.
Now this is for Monday evening, 8 o'clock. The GFS has gotten a little slower again. The European doesn't even have it on land until later Tuesday morning. Mm-hmm. So, clearly the models seem to be gravitating in that direction. Now, from Tuesday morning to Friday morning, and by the way, apologize for some of the, it's taking a while for these maps to load. It takes until from Tuesday morning, or Monday night, till Thursday afternoon for this system to move from where it goes inland to the Georgia-Florida border in the north. That's less than 300 miles. It's going to take 3 days for this to happen. If this plays out, this is a problem. It's a problem with rainfall in particular, because you're going to be measuring it in feet if that's the case.
Right. Frictional drag. Once again, you take a very moist tropical system like this one and move it over land. It's like wringing out a gigantic damp sponge. And that frictional drag will perhaps result in 10, 20, dare I even say 30 inches of rain. We may be looking at something like what happened to the Houston area with Harvey.
Well, Houston with Harvey, or last year with Florence.
It's not so much potency in terms of wind strength. It's the problem with these things in recent years has been them slowing down and just staying in one particular area and just hour after hour after hour raining, and that's been caused most of the damage over the last few years.
So we're going to look at I'm going to bring up the upper air. This is Saturday afternoon. On the Saturday afternoon, we're looking at the 18,000 foot level and the flow in the upper atmosphere. And I'm going to just identify a few things so you can carry it along. You can watch how the whole thing evolves. And why does the important thing is, why are the models, why is it doing that? Okay, so this is Saturday afternoon. We've been talking about the fact that there is going to be a strong upper high building from the Atlantic westward into the southeast. And indeed, we do have that. And I'm going to outline, just like you would see the isobar at the surface. This is a line of equal height. Mm-hmm. And we are looking at the upper atmosphere at about 18,000 feet. There's your upper high. So remember, winds are clockwise around high. So the steering flow, is east to west. Where is Dorian? Dorian is sitting just south of this building high. So where will it go? Well, it's going to respond to that upper high and move either west or west-northwest, depending on how strong it is. to continue this on Saturday, you've got another upper high that's out in the southwest, okay? And then from Nebraska to Missouri to Illinois, Indiana, Northern Virginia, across New Jersey, out into the Atlantic, that is the southern end of the westerlies, or that northern Canadian jet that we've been talking about virtually all summer, and how it moves up and moves south. And the area, there's an area here in between, right in here. Okay, this whole area in here, Joe. This is really as far as a steering winds, that's kind of like a no man's land.
Right.
Okay, where there's very little that the steering flow collapses. It could go around the periphery of the high, but the other high is so far to the west that you've got this area in between where the winds are very, very light in the upper atmosphere, and there's no real push.
Right.
So that's for Saturday. Now let's jump ahead. I'm going to take it to where we are at landfall, which is Monday night, and I'm going to bring that up, and you're going to see the steering with this. Hold on, I'll just make sure everybody got to see that. Okay, just want to make sure everybody's got the right map up. Okay, hold on one second, Mr. Rayo. So I don't remember if I did this ahead of time or not. I don't think I may not have. Let's try. Let me try it again. Okay. There it is. Okay, so that's the map that I just drew. So you've got your counterclockwise, in case I didn't bring it up on the screen. I'm doing so many things, I'm telling you, I really just lose it. But there's your upper high. There's Dorian in red. And that orange area I drew is the no man's land, where the steering winds are very light. And, of course, you've got the southern edge of those westerlies that come out of Canada down into Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, Northern Virginia, to off the New Jersey coast. We've got a brick wall here in the Northeast. We've got no problems down into the mid-Atlantic states. Now let me jump to the next view, which is, this is Monday night, okay, at 8 o'clock. Now at this point on the GFS, you've got the upper high is actually at this point weakened to a certain extent. It's not like what you just saw. It probably reaches its peak strength later on Sunday. There's still a high out here, but it's not nearly as well defined. You've got your westerly winds in the upper atmosphere from the northern jet actually dipping south down into North Carolina. And then you've got this other upper high that's building eastward from out of the plains. And notice that the no man's land has kind of moved over here in this area. Right. In fact, we might even extend it further south. It's this whole area down here where the steering currents are getting very, very weak. So eventually it loses that push. What's there to move it northward from there?
And that's why we have some changes from day to day. I mean, yesterday, as I just noted, the storm track looked like it was going to go into the Gulf of Mexico and take it toward New Orleans. And now with that no man's zone, as you just pointed out, and the lack of any significant steering, you're right. Where's it going to go? Is it going to drift northward through the spine of Florida and on up into South Carolina? Or, Joe, we're so far out.
Yeah.
We're still like 5-6 days out. Anything can happen.
But now I want to just jump to Wednesday, because, again, just going by what you said, now if we jump to Wednesday, the upper high off in the Atlantic is trying to build back to some extent. Here's the western edge of it. So now you've got a southerly wind there, and here's your upper high. But there's another upper high that the model seems to pick up on that's building over in Arkansas and pushing eastward into Tennessee. So, again, where is Dorian in all of this at this point? Well, it's drifting northward, but it's still kind of in that no man's land. Right. So you're in between these two ridges. There's no real push. The real push would be is if you could get this northern jet somehow. If this northern jet were to come all the way down and pick it up, but the southern edge of that jet is down into Northern Virginia. So right. Until there's something there in the atmosphere to really just pull it up, it's going to be a really tough sell.
And that, that doesn't bode well either for people who live in, let's say, Georgia or the Carolinas, because if it's in that no man's zone and it just slowly drifts northward, there's going to be some very, very heavy rain, torrential rains in that zone as well, all the way up to the Carolinas. And it may not be, Joe, until later next week that perhaps the bottom end of that northern jet stream attaches itself or gets involved with Dorian and literally punts it or boots it out over the ocean, now, sparing us from any great problems. Maybe.
Or are we going to go back to some of the ideas that we saw in the last couple of days, where this high that's sitting in Arkansas is stronger and winds up? This is the reason why you saw those runs where it was taking it into the northwestern Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
That high winds up being stronger, so there's enough steering to push it westward into the Gulf. So will it come back to that? I don't know. We're talking 6 days from now. But I just, at least the point is through all of this, is that there's still a lot of uncertainty with regards to how exactly is the upper pattern going to play out for Dorian across as it moves. Once it gets past, it goes through the Bahamas. I feel, it looks like it's going to make a Florida landfall.
Right.
And then after that, does it move along? Is it going to be moving into an environment where the steering winds aloft are going to collapse, and it's going to take 3 days or 2 or 3 days for it to transverse the state from south of Florida, from south to north? Those are longer term answers that we're not going to really get a grasp of until we get through the weekend. But this is something that we have to watch carefully, because, as you said, we saw it with Harvey and we saw it last year with Florence, where it gets into this no man's land and you wind up getting rain in feet.
Right, and the storm surge along probably much of the Florida coastline from Sunday night into Monday is going to be Category 4 storm. My goodness, it's going to be devastating if that holds at that strength, or reaches or attains that particular strength. So you got the wind, you got the rain. It's just going to be. And I have a funny feeling, Joe, that before this is all over said and done, that the name Dorian is going to be added to the.
Might be on the retired list.
Might be on the retired list.
Well, let's let the first thing we're going to have to wait and see on is, does it strengthen overnight into tomorrow? Then we have to make sure it makes that, to see if it makes that turn to the west northwest, as opposed to going northwest.
Right.
And if it does those two things, then we see what happens when it gets near to the Bahamas. Does it make this kind of slight west-southwest jog that the new GFS and European indicated earlier, or does it go more west or west-northwest forever and the landfall's further north? And again, what happens after that is anyone's guess at this point. Today's late run off the North Carolina coast, as you said, there's another cold front coming through in the east, and it goes northeast and goodbye, and actually passes on this run pretty just south of Nova Scotia. But we're talking here 10 days from now, Mr. Ray.
Right,
and you know that's going to, they're going to be still a lot more changes to deal with.
And also we've just been going through a period along much of the eastern seaboard concerning former tropical storm, tropical depression Aaron, churning up the seas up and down much of the eastern seaboard. And obviously, if we're looking at a track that ultimately or eventually takes that storm out to sea near and along the eastern seaboard, there's going to be another round of rip currents, undertow, and the like with this particular system come later next week. But again, we don't know. I mean, if that high that you just pointed out down over the southern states strengthens, the ridge strengthens a bit more, it may force Dorian to go, on that track more into the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody can tell.
Right.
Nobody can tell.
Here's the rainfall consequence of the GFS. So you get that whole yellow area is 12 to 24 inches.
Oh, dear.
So it runs from about Miami straight up through the southeast coast.
Just to the south of Norfolk, Virginia. So
yeah.
It's
again, based on what this model is doing all the way through, I would just again emphasize that at least through let's go through day 5. If you want to be speculative, day 5 only gets us to the point where it's just made landfall.
Right.
This is Tuesday evening, so there's your rainfall amount through day 5. So we've got a lot of time here to figure out the final details.
Right. I can't say any more. I mean, what more could we possibly say? I do want to mention one thing about, and this touched a memory for me. Aaron, the tropical depression, former tropical storm for a brief interval of time yesterday. That name, Aaron, these storms recycle every 6 years.
Right.
And it's interesting to point out that in 2001, we had a Hurricane Aaron, and that storm, for a brief interval of time, was taking a course right toward New York City. And at the last minute, the storm got deflected away from the coast and away from New York. The date in question when that happened was the night of September 10th, 2001. Right. And that beautiful weather that occurred the morning of that terrible day in 2001, September 11, was ushered in by a cold front. That cold front actually helped to push Aaron out to sea and keep it from reaching the New York City metropolitan area. You kind of wonder now what would have happened if we didn't have that cold front, if the storm had continued on a track up toward the New York metropolitan area or even up into the northeastern U.S., whether or not a lot of the flights that day might have been canceled or whatever, and that terrible day may never have happened. It is the forgotten hurricane, and may have played a role in changing history, but the name Aaron, whenever it sprouts up every 6 years, I always think about that one date back in 2001, September 11th.
I always think WPC, by the way, the Weather Prediction Center, does a good job with their maps. You and I have talked about this often. This is their 7-day forecast, which ends next Thursday evening. And that area that's kind of that brownish area, that's 7 inches of rain or more.
Right.
And again, if you're talking about something that's going to be crawling up through Florida, the map tomorrow will probably be more robust. But it seems, if you looked at this, Joe, that it suggests that WPC thinks that the storm is going to come in somewhere in the southern third of the state and then move northward just inland of the coast and then make the turn off South Carolina and maybe out off coastal North Carolina and run out to the northeast. If you just look at the precip field, right, that's I think where WPC's head is at when it comes to this.
Look at our area. I mean, our area is, relatively speaking, is dry. I mean, we have some shades of green, but I'm guessing from the legend that probably means maybe a quarter to a half an inch, perhaps. At most.
Well, no, the lightest green is actually only a tenth of an inch.
Right.
You have to get into the first blue is a half an inch.
Right.
And that taking out through 7 days there'll be a cold front at some point next week. Right. This is a time of year where normally we turn pretty dry. September and October, except for years with tropical systems, usually is when we see some of the nicest weather of the year.
You're absolutely correct. October is the clearest month of the year in the northeastern part of the country. In fact, there's an old saying in New England that October always has at least 19 clear days. I don't know whether or not that's absolutely true.
So how many actually? Yeah, how did they get to 19?
I don't know. But
19 is St. Joseph's Day. You know, my grandmother would immediately have pounced on the 19 and said that's San Giuseppe.
And it's reflective of what you just mentioned about the fact that we get into October, and it's also Indian summer. It tends to be a dry stretch. And then right after we get past October, boom, we go right into the dregs of November and December, and immediately everything turns cloudy and dank and dreary and whatever.
By the way, this is the European model's view today of what we discussed with respect to the upper air, the strengthening ridge out in the Atlantic, the ridge that's out from Texas west, and you see Dorian goes northwest, then west-northwest under the ridge, gets a nudge south, but take a look at that little blue spot, Joe, that's in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and goes into the Gulf. That, I think, is going to be really important in terms of ultimately determining what happens, because if this isn't there, I would think that Dorian would turn a bit more northwest and head further up into the Florida coastline on the East Coast instead of taking that jog to the west.
That deep shade of red that appears on the very last frame is that ridge of high pressure you mentioned earlier, which if it manages to protrude more to the east, might be able to serve to, deflect Dorian not northward but more to the
westward
more to the west. So
again, this at least illustrates the forecast dilemma in the longer term and why folks that are watching from up here, they're looking and seeing some of these models bringing it up the coast in one fashion or another. Well, you're going to have a lot of things happen in a certain combination in terms of the jet stream to the north and the two ridges on either side and the storm itself in order to even bring it remotely close to impacting areas in the mid-Atlantic and in the Northeast. And my own feeling is, Joe, with this northern jet being so persistent from Virginia northward, with those westerly winds in the upper atmosphere, it's going to be awfully. You really can't bring something up
Right.
with a westerly wind in the upper atmosphere.
Exactly. So I would agree with you. If it can get as far north as, let's say, the Carolinas, Cape Hatteras, or even Norfolk, Virginia, further north from there, the upper level winds are just going to be too strong and will, as I mentioned earlier, punt that system out and away. But of course, as you know, even if it does that, all it has to do is get within a couple few hundred miles of the tri-state New York area, and all heck is going to break loose up here with the. Could it possibly do that?
I know.
It's
All right, so just really quick, no issues, at least for those watching in Florida. Nothing's going on tomorrow. Nothing's going out of the ordinary. Saturday, Sunday. Let's not forget that there's going to probably be impact in the northern Bahamas. So we'll probably see hurricane watches maybe go up at some point in the next couple of days. I don't, maybe they may be able to wait till Saturday if there's not going to be anything coming until later Monday if it keeps slowing down. So right now, if the slowing trend continues, you're looking maybe at a landfall later in the day on Monday and Monday night. But bear in mind that is movable. Okay, if it starts moving at a steady clip, then you may have to go back and we'll have to move the time up. If it keeps slowing down, or if the Europeans it comes almost to a halt for a little while Tuesday morning, you might push the landfall back a little bit more. So you do have some time to do whatever it is you have to do to prepare.
And I was just thinking about the fact that there are people out there who may have family, friends, or maybe even themselves, Joe, who had planned on going on a cruise, maybe down to the Bahamas, or maybe even out to Bermuda, or someplace in the eastern corridor that certainly will have to keep their eye on the storm. I'm not saying that the storm is heading for Bermuda, but a storm of that magnitude certainly could churn the waters up and cause some very rough seas that could be felt even as far as Bermuda is concerned. So a lot of cruise lines are probably getting a lot of phone calls from people who are saying, like, what are you going to do? What's our ship going to, that kind of stuff.
I just want to acknowledge Ann Grover, David Schwartz, Johnny Quest, William Huber, and Scott Briller, all Super Chat contributors tonight. Thank you so much for doing that. Let's run backwards. Frank Russ, can we address the fact that hurricane force winds only extend 15 miles from the center? Is this cause for relief? You do bring up a good point, Frank, with respect that this storm actually is still relatively small. Right. We might see the wind field expand over time, but so far, because of all that dry air that was in the environment that it was sitting in, it was a very, very small storm. If you weren't inside that core, you could have been 40 miles to the west of the center yesterday, and that's. In fact, I did even notice that the observation point on the easternmost point of Puerto Rico, while hurricane force wind gusts were going on in St. Thomas, that point in the easternmost point of Puerto Rico had a 5-mile-an-hour wind, and they were certainly inside this. On the satellite, you would look at it and you think, okay, they should be at least getting gales. In this particular case, because the storm is small, you're seeing a very, very tight core, so you have to get into that core. Now, whether the core expands or not as it moves westward, we'll know we're going to know over the next coming days when the plane gets in there and takes a look at where how far the gales extend as it flies around and samples.
There was one storm many years ago in the 70s. I think it was Gladys, and if you looked at it on a satellite picture, it almost looked like a cotton ball. It didn't look like a hurricane with a pinpoint eye. And it was something like there was like 130 or 140 mile per hour winds,
right.
But they were all within like a 30-mile radius of that storm. It was an amazingly tight. That was about as tight as you'll ever get. I think though with this storm we'll see a bit of a broadening.
I remember last year we had, I think it was Beryl, one of the early ones out in the tropical Atlantic, where I think it even got to a minimal hurricane. And gales extended out like 15 miles from the center. Yeah. It was so tight. Some ridiculously small number. And one of my favorites on Twitter, Cranky Weather Guy, called it a severe thunder shower barrel.
That's it.
Because it was
That's
so
it.
small.
And we had a visitation here in the tri-state area in 1976, Hurricane Bell, which moved right across central Long Island and through the Long Island Sound up into Connecticut. That too was a very tight little storm as well.
And weakening as it came here. Two things. You can address this question. Actually, well, both you can certainly address this question. So Chuck Cardillo says that on average October is the sunniest month and November is the cloudiest, apparently, or one of the cloudiest. But he's up in the Catskills,
right?
So certainly for him it could very well be
right. It's a very, very sharp demarcation between very clear and very dry and very lovely weather in October, and then all of a sudden you get into November and poof, the amount of the percentage of cloud cover increases dramatically. It's not a gradual change. It's a very, very sharp change. And you're absolutely right. I don't have the figures in front of me, but whereas October is probably one of the clearer months, November is one of the cloudier months.
Johnny Quest asked, there was two things. Well, Johnny brought up the fact that this, we've heard the phrase bombogenesis. And
well, it's not anymore. They don't use that anymore. Now it's called bomb cyclone.
Oh, bomb cyclone.
All of a sudden,
either one. It's kind of redundant to call a hurricane a bomb cyclone because it already is.
Right.
So we really don't use it. We usually that phrase it has been used in reference to non-tropical systems, mainly winter storms that deepen very rapidly,
right,
and create heavy snows and everything else that goes along with it. But it isn't applied to hurricanes. But he also asked, is there supposed to be a king tide this weekend along the coast of Florida?
A
king tide.
A king tide.
Do you know what that is?
I've never heard of a king
supposedly
tide.
This is supposed to be the highest high tide of the year.
I would have.
Well, we can look it up really quick.
Well, I can tell you that in February we had the so-called super moon, and supposedly that was the closest full moon of the 2019 year overall. I would have thought that if we had the high tides, that would have been the highest or most extreme tides.
These are the king tide dates for Fort Lauderdale. Is Saturday for the king tide.
Right. And we're at new moon now.
So that's what. Okay.
Right.
So
this new moon, and I believe the new moon coming up at the end of September. I'm not sure which one is the closer, but one of these new moons, this one or the.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. King tides are the highest tides of the year. They're called king tides, cause minor flooding along coastal Florida over the first weekend of November. This is on Google. These tidal floods are often called sunny day or blue sky floods as they occur on an otherwise beautiful, calm day.
It almost sounds like what they have sometimes up in the Bay of Fundy, where they have and I actually. My wife and I visited Nova Scotia back in the 80s, and we actually, this is amazing, Joe, some guy who actually is right near, I think, the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, invites people to come onto his property to watch the tidal bore
just roll in,
and it's like amazing, and that's a regular phenomenon for them up there near the bay. They have something like a difference of like 25 or 30 feet between high tide and low tide in the Bay of Fundy.
Bobby Livingsworth says, is it a good thing or a bad thing that it is slowed down? That it would slow down? I don't know. I mean, either way, it doesn't really bode well.
Well, it's a good thing in the sense that if it's slowing down, it gives you more time to make advanced preparations. But it's not good if the slowing occurs as the storm is hitting you, because that means you're going to be in it in terms of wind and or rain for a much longer interval of time. Something you do not want to experience. One thing, Joe, about hurricanes versus nor'easters, and I've often said this, a hurricane is kind of like a boxing match that lasts 2 rounds. The hurricane comes in, it hits you with a knockout punch, boom, it's over, fight over, everything is over,
right.
The storm is over. Nor'easters, it's like you're on the ropes,
for a
and you just keep getting pounded over and over and over and over again, and that's not fun either. So,
all right, Larry Stepek. It says, thanks for reassuring. Some are already talking about models having it hit New York. Okay, just let me make this, I want to just make this clear. We're focused here on the short range with regards to what's going on with respect to Florida into the middle part of next week. We don't even have that figured out yet. So anybody that's actually, to me, it's really grossly irresponsible if people are pulling, and this happens every single time we have one of these things. If they're pulling out maps on a particular run of the model that show a low print in one place or another in order to generate clicks, it's just, it's
absurd.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
And they're being absurd. So I don't even know who is doing it. I'm just basically throwing them all in the same, can of garbage. There's no point to it.
Earlier this month, the models were generating what looked like, for all the world, like a Category 3 or Category 4 hurricane that was moving right up along the eastern seaboard. It did this not on one run, but on several runs. But we're talking about 200 or plus hours out. And we're looking at this, Joe and I, and we're saying to ourselves, wow, what's this all about or whatever. But, we never got really concerned. All of a sudden, come the next day, what happened? Where's the storm? Where's the storm of the century? It just completely and totally vanished.
Right.
You can't look at these things beyond, let's say, 4 or 5 days and put any semblance of credibility on them.
Just as, by the way, and just also in the other direction is the fact that 4 or 5 days ago, or maybe a little bit longer than that, but certainly at least 5 days ago, we were on here discussing, everybody lamenting, at least the tropical weather fans were lamenting about how quiet it was.
Right.
And I had said that, look, you're going to just basically wake up one day and there are going to be three name storms on the map. We've blown through 3 names in the last 7 days, and there's more to come in the longer term based on what I saw on the models, but we're not even focused on that.
What's the old saying that traditionally there's always at least one named storm on Labor Day?
Usually.
And that is the case. And also last year, in case any of you forgot, a lot of you were lamenting the fact that we had a very quiet August last year, and all of a sudden we had an explosive September, and who knows? This may be the beginning of another round of that.
Ryan Ford and we did talk about this earlier. Being that it's taking longer for Dorian to come out, could that result in potentially having a different upper air setup at the time, more conducive to having a storm track up the coast? Well, certainly the timing, the timing of different short waves is going to change if the storm speed changes and in terms of the location. So that's why you have to be careful when you see these models in the longer term showing a certain thing. It's because when the model was run and all the parameters are there, given all the data that was there at the time, it times out in a certain way.
Right.
But then when the model is run again 6 months from 6 hours from now, would that we could get it only once every 6 months. But if it ran 6 hours from now and the timing of one thing changes, it changes the timing of everything else. And you wind up with a totally different outcome. Even though the same players may be all there, they may all be in different positions. So the answer to your question is yes in both directions.
Now, who asked that question?
Ryan Ford, who's a future Met.
Is he
a young future Met?
Tinge of illusion of the fact that maybe we might get the storm to come this way.
No, maybe that's. Let
me tell you something, Ryan. The two of us. I won't speak
Ryan
for
is
you.
a good kid, by the way, just so you know.
I won't speak for you. I'll speak for me. I was one of the big storm lovers. I absolutely,
so was I. You can speak for me.
Looking and saying, well, maybe if it turned this way, we can get out of it. Maybe if you know what? As you get older, and as you go through all of these storms, be it in the winter or the summertime, you get to the point where I personally just don't want to deal with these anymore. I don't know why you get the not the enthusiasm knocked out of you, but you just get tired. It's crazy.
Just to put this in a bit of perspective, who's on tonight but our friend Alfred Phillips from Wainwright, Alaska? We're dealing with tropical systems, and he's watching he's soon going to be watching the Arctic ice at Wainwright, Alaska, take over on the North Slope.
I tell you, you're up there, and we talk about how here at the mid latitudes we're beginning to see, or we have noticed over the last few weeks alone, how it's gotten darker, how quickly it's gotten darker in the evening hours. The sun is setting now, I think on average like 2 minutes earlier each night. Up there in Alaska, my goodness, it's getting dark real fast. The dark season is slowly but surely entering. I'm not sure if he's in that part of Alaska where In the middle of at winter time, they get maybe 2 hours of daylight or something.
Well, he's right on the North Slope. Wainwright's right at the very top there. He could watch the polar bears walking on the ice.
Lovely.
Let's see.
With a bottle of Coke in their hand.
Ruthless Goat says, I had to step out for a minute. Did I miss anything? Landfall, Upgrade, The Rapture? The answer to all of that, is yes. Just yes. Okay? All of the above. The Battle of the Two Highs, Ryan Ford, pretty much, that really is when, and the little shortwave and the Northern Stream Jet. It's those three. Those are the three big players in all of this. And, of course, Dorian itself, which, by the way, we may have the new advisory. And we're going to take a look at that. Oh, Alfred says he's 43 where he is, wind chill of 37. He's on the western Arctic coast region in northern Alaska.
Lovely.
I got to go there one day.
Why? No, actually,
because...
I take that back. I've been to Alaska on 2 occasions, and I have to tell you, it is a very, very beautiful state. As the late PBS painter Bob Ross would always say, because he lived in Alaska for a while, he said God was having a good day when he made Alaska. And it is. If you go there while it's still wild, because it's just an amazing thing to see.
James Goebel from Fargo, North Dakota. He's our first person from Fargo, North Dakota.
Wow.
That is, I get, honestly, I'm not being facetious or sarcastic or anything. I really get such a kick out of seeing people here from places that you don't often meet. I've never met anyone from Fargo. I think that's so great.
It's possible to do something like this.
Can you imagine? Could we ever even imagine this?
No. Fargo, North Dakota, by the way, I believe that's where Roger Maris, the great New York Yankee, is buried. I think he lived there in Fargo. And it's awfully cold in Fargo, too.
And we're just as equally excited that Shelly Man Studios from Bridgeport, Connecticut. Okay, one $60 ferry ride away for me from Port Jefferson to Bridgeport. And that Port Jeff ferry, by the way, is it's a nice boat ride.
And I wonder whether or not, I asked this question before, if anybody out there knows, please post it. WICC 600 on the AM radio dial out of Bridgeport, Connecticut, for many, many years during the Labor Day weekend, I believe, which is, of course, coming up, used to have the $1 million fish prize. They would tag a specific fish, and if you happened to catch it and bring it to the station, you would win, I think, $1 million.
They have a few. There was a big bluefish tournament this past weekend, and I know up where my daughter is, up near Thomaston, a little bit further north. They have an annual tournament there, and the first prize is a Hitchcock chair.
Oh,
and it's a huge deal. It's been going on for years. I know that what you just mentioned seems familiar. I don't know if it's $1 million. Maybe they ran out of money.
Yeah.
But there's something similar to that. There's a few of them that there's a few tournaments similar
of course,
to that.
I don't think you would get it in one lump sum. The late WNEW 1130, which is now Bloomberg Radio, had a contest like 20 or 30 years ago. Win $1 million. They would play every single Sinatra record that he ever did, except for one. And if you could identify the one record that they didn't play, you'd win $1 million. Of course, it was spread out over 20 years. And I think the station, halfway through that 20-year period, changed over to Bloomberg. So I don't know how they worked that
Anthony Orr correctly points out, and I forgot, there are no watches or warnings up, so there's no intermediate advisory. So it's only 6-hour advisories here. Right. And Shelly Man Studios said they had a bluefish event at his job, Captain Cove. So yeah, these tournaments, these fishing tournaments are always going on, and some of them do have prize money.
And right now, it's snapper season. I used to go snapper fishing with my uncle, my father, Atlantic Beach, Reynolds Inlet. Now we're going back like 50 years. I have not done that since. I was trying to hint to my son, who occasionally goes fishing. He even did some deep sea fishing. Just a few weeks ago, I said, "How about if we can go?" "Yeah, Dad. Why don't you tell me where we can go snapper fishing?"
You want to go off the Atlantic Bridge?
Right by the Atlantic Beach Bridge.
Right.
There was a marina called Hennings.
Right.
Probably doesn't exist anymore, but that's where we used to fish for snappers.
I used to fish for snappers in Pelham Bay.
Yeah,
when I was a kid.
Those are
I
great.
used to bring them home. I'd bring 30 or 40 home, and my mother would deep breadcrumb them and deep fry them.
Just
that
throw
was
them
great.
on the baby bluefish, right?
Yeah. Okay, so Ingrid Nunez says, I'm in Hilton Head, South Carolina. Are we out of the woods yet? Should we start preparing to evacuate? There's nothing going on here, Ingrid, that impacts South Carolina right now. And if we're talking about a Florida landfall, that the whole thing's going to take a while to evolve. You really have nothing to worry about through the weekend and into the first part of next week. I would certainly I would pay attention to what's happening in the meantime. But at the moment, I certainly don't think you have really very much to concern yourself with.
Right.
And Christopher, you know the rest, says good evening from Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome, Christopher. Also, Joe, do you think it's unusual that now possibly 3 years in a row we have 3 major storms that stall or enter a no man's land? Good question.
Right.
I could think of long stretches where it didn't happen.
Right.
I guess I got to go back and refresh myself with some of the storms. But I completely forgot. I was reading up yesterday about 2004, where there were 4 hurricanes that went into Florida in a 6-week time frame. Jean, Yvonne, what's the F storm? Was it Fran? Jean, Yvonne, and one other, and all 4 got retired.
Right.
But yeah, I completely. Once upon a time, I remembered them all. These days, I don't. What did I just say? Exactly. I guess my answer to that question is probably not that unusual. It just there are instances of this happening in the past. Maybe we are in a cycle that began in 1995 of increased hurricane activity. So if we have increased activity, I would think you would have the probability of getting into a pattern where these things would stall out, would appear more often when you have more storms. But I don't know if I don't honestly know. Looking back, I could recall a few instances faintly in the back of my mind. Although if you asked me to point a finger to which year specifically right now, I couldn't tell you without doing research. But it would be kind of, it almost would certainly feels kind of weird to have we've already had 2, Florence, and the year before we had Harvey. Now, does it happen again here in this instance? Only we'll know in the fullness of time.
Time will tell.
Just running back because I want to make sure I get questions. We got you're still good time wise, right? It's 8:06.
But where am I going?
You're not booked. Thank you, Danny Nankumar, for thanking us. Let's see, Mark G. No matter what, they're always talking about winter. They're waiting. Well, now that we're going into September, certainly you have to say that the clock is ticking. Let's see.
I noticed that the Farmer's Almanac, both of them, the old Farmer's Almanac is calling for another relatively mild and wet winter in the Northeast, and the other Farmer's Almanac is calling for cold and snow. And last year we got a little of both, I think.
Yeah.
So
Anthony Orr says from the one of our 2 resident statisticians. The other one is Scott Briller, who's also known as the chairman, because he's always the first one on the chat board. And Anthony says from Colorado State University, since 1900, 9 hurricanes have made landfall in the continental U.S. on Labor Day weekend. The most recent was Hurricane Gustav, which made landfall in Louisiana in 2008.
And of course, let's not forget the Labor Day hurricane of 1926, supposedly the strongest or most intense hurricane on record. Something like a barometric pressure, some ridiculous barometric pressure, like 26.8 inches or whatever. The Labor Day, the traditional peak of the hurricane season is September the 10th, and we're now coming down the home stretch to that.
Right.
So.
Tuddy's, and perhaps because we also just had discussed this here on the show back weeks ago. We brought it up a few times. The El Nino faded away and is now gone.
Right.
But it kind of happened relatively recently, and I was sort of speculating over the fact that perhaps there is a lag time. You have to wait for the atmosphere to kind of play catch up, and maybe that's the reason why we really didn't see a whole lot of activity during after the first two systems. It's been pretty quiet for about a 4 to 5 week stretch,
right.
And that maybe this is going to be one of those backloaded years where it happens more in the second half than in the first.
Right. Well, the mid August to mid October, with the peak in around September 10th. You're right. It could very well be that we could be seeing a lot more in the second half period, on the downturn, so to speak, of the of activity. And who knows? This may be one of those years where we see a rather significant storm in November, dare I say.
Yeah, it could be. Tuddy's Young says, are we safe in New Orleans, in the New Orleans area, because Dorian going to Florida, and will it get into the Gulf of Mexico?
Now, I brought this up at the onset of our conversation.
So he may have joined late, by the way.
Yeah, yesterday it looked like the storm would go tracking across Florida into the Gulf of Mexico and take a swipe at possibly Louisiana or Mississippi. And today, now, all of a sudden, they're out of it, with the storm slowing down, taking a more northerly track, maybe even away from the Gulf coastal area. Tomorrow, it may be just right back to where it was yesterday. We just really can't say with any certainty or surety much beyond 4 or 5 days. So you're not out of the woods yet completely.
I just saw Forever Orange asked, can this hit Texas? It'll have to take an awful lot of a big upper high to build up in the south, in the Gulf, across the Gulf states, to drive it into Texas. But that being said, we talked about that second low that's going to be developing in the central Gulf of Mexico, that's going to pull Dorian westward and maybe a little bit more south. If that low is important, that might be something to watch. So let's see if we get convection developing out there in the Gulf, and whether it stays just a broad low, or that you wind up eventually with some kind of tropical depression or tropical storm from that low. But for Dorian to move across Florida and then move straight across, it would take a big upper high to build across the Gulf states, and we don't really see that. See that at the moment.
Even the most extreme cases that we've seen, where it was supposedly going to track into the Gulf of Mexico, it never really made it much further west than, let's say, New Orleans. So I think your folks in Texas are pretty safe from this. Folks in Texas are probably just all watching, especially along the Texas Gulf Coast. They're probably like sitting there saying, we're in the bleachers. We don't need to come here.
Right, we did this already 2 years ago. We don't need to do it again.
Yes.
All right, you know what? Let's wrap it up. It's an hour and 10-minute show we did. So you can tell Mrs. Rayo that we did an hour and 10-minute show, and Mrs. Rayo will say...
She can't believe that we go... He says, you guys should go no more than 10 or 15 minutes. You'll never hold an audience longer than that. And we have almost 200 people who have stayed with us. Thank you very, very much.
I'm just going to leave it there. We'll let it speak for itself. All right, so let me just run down a couple of things with the audience regarding what I'm going to be doing going forward. So tomorrow morning, Weather in 5, which I usually try to get it up on YouTube before 9 a.m. So you'll get a quick update of what Dorian has been doing overnight. Patreon members, for those of you who are on my subscription platform, and I'm going to put the link up on the chat board for those of you who might be interested. It's just $2 a month, and you get a lot of extra weather stuff, including Weather in 10, which we did today, and it was all Dorian focused. So it's sort of like having your own private television show with the Patreon members. So I've been doing that separately, and this way I can get into the really important points and spend a little bit more time with it. So members get that extra post. You can message me at any time. So the link is up there. There will be a Weather in 10 for tomorrow. Then we'll have our regular YouTube live stream tomorrow night at. I'm going to be by myself tomorrow here, so you will be off tomorrow.
No,
you're coming in early, but you're working the early shift.
I'm working early.
So 7 o'clock Eastern time, tentatively scheduled. I might have to push it back to 7:30 so I can get a little dinner. But I certainly will schedule the live stream a few hours before. And the chat board opens up the minute the show is scheduled. So a number of you jump on early, which is great because sometimes I can jump into the conversation as well. So if you would like to get involved in the conversation, the chat board opens when you get the notification that there will be a live show at a given time. Quick heads up for Saturday, because I'm going to be working at WPIX TV on Saturday evening. Yes. And therefore, I will do a morning live stream on Saturday. So figure maybe around 10 or 11 a.m. And then there will also be the regular weather in 5. And I'm going to try to squeeze in a weather in 10 before I get on the train to go to work. Sunday will be a normal day. I will do a live stream on Sunday with Dorian on what's the word I'm looking for? On the table.
Right.
With Dorian on the table, we'll have a live stream on Sunday, because I know lately on the weekends I've been taking some time off. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up in terms of the schedule going forward. Website posts on the website and also on the app. And you can find either of us on our Facebook pages, meteorologist Joe Chaffee.
Meteorologist Joe Rayo.
You're Joe Rayo Weather.
Oh, Joe Rayo Weather.
Right,
yes.
Joe Rayo Weather. If
well,
you do
meteorologist Joe Rayo Weather.
Right.
But Joe Rayo Weather is
the page name. So you search that. You can like his page, and then search mine. You can like my page, download my free app, which is on Google Play or on the App Store. Just search Meteorologist Joe Chaffee, or just plain old Joe Chaffee. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Be safe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.